Granite walls rise 11 meters into the African sky, curving in a smooth, unbroken line for over 250 meters, built entirely from stone blocks fitted together with such precision that not one drop of mortar holds them in place. No European ever laid a single stone of this structure. No European ever designed it, funded it, or supervised its builders. And yet for nearly a century after colonial explorers first documented it, the official position of the government controlling the land it stood on was that Africans could not possibly have built it at all. The walls belonged to Great Zimbabwe, and the sustained effort required to deny an entire civilization credit for its own capital city involved something considerably more deliberate than simple ignorance. It involved removing archaeological evidence layer by layer, in some cases with dynamite. It involved rewriting official guidebooks under direct government order. It involved a colonial state built on the foundational claim that the land had been essentially empty of civilization before Europeans arrived, a claim that a curving granite wall 250 meters long made considerably harder to sustain the longer anyone looked at it honestly. Consider what that means for a moment. A government does not typically bother expending real, sustained institutional effort suppressing an archaeological curiosity nobody cares about. It expends that effort specifically when the truth threatens something the government needs people to keep believing. That specific dynamic, a stone wall powerful enough to make an entire settler government nervous for the better part of a century, is where tonight's story really begins. There is more here for you, if you would like it. If you find a place like this one, quiet, patient, built for the long dark of a winter night, consider subscribing, so the channel can keep finding you when you need it most. And for those who would like a little more, channel members receive early access to every documentary before it appears here, and a quiet way to support the slow work these stories take to make. Tonight, though, we go back to the hills. What actually happened at Great Zimbabwe between roughly the 11th and 15th centuries, who built it, what it traded, why it was eventually abandoned, is a remarkable story of an African trading kingdom that connected the interior of the continent to markets as distant as China. But the story of what happened to that history afterward, in the hands of the people who refused to believe Africans capable of building it, is in some ways just as revealing, a century-long argument over stone walls that became, without either side always admitting it, an argument about who got to write African history at all. Consider what it actually took to sustain that argument for as long as colonial Rhodesia sustained it. Not a single dismissive comment. Not one report that got quietly ignored. It required repeated, deliberate institutional effort, spanning multiple governments and multiple generations of officials, each one choosing, again and again, to keep insisting on a story the physical evidence had already stopped supporting decades earlier. What follows tonight traces that effort in detail, block by block, because understanding exactly how a false story gets sustained this long turns out to matter almost as much as understanding what the true one actually was. The site sits on the Zimbabwean plateau, a stretch of elevated grassland and woodland in what is now southeastern Zimbabwe, roughly 30 kilometers from the modern town of Masvingo, chosen by its original builders for reasons that combine practical and symbolic considerations still debated by researchers today. The surrounding landscape offered reliable rainfall, fertile soil for cattle grazing, and, critically, an abundance of granite outcrops whose natural exfoliation, the way this rock type fractures into flat, regular slabs when exposed to the region's dramatic temperature swings between day and night, provided ready-made building material that skilled masons could shape into precisely fitted blocks without needing iron tools sophisticated enough to cut stone from scratch. Construction at the site proceeded across several centuries, with archaeological dating suggesting the earliest stone structures date to around the 11th century, the settlement growing in scale and architectural ambition through a peak period generally placed between the 13th and 15th centuries, when the site likely served as the political and religious capital of a kingdom whose economic power rested substantially on controlling trade routes carrying gold, ivory, and other valuable goods from the African interior toward the Indian Ocean coast. The full site divides into three main architectural zones that visitors and archaeologists have named the Hill Complex, the Great Enclosure, and the Valley Ruins, each serving what researchers believe were distinct but interconnected functions within the kingdom's political and spiritual life. The Hill Complex, built atop a granite outcrop overlooking the surrounding valley, incorporates natural rock formations directly into its walls and enclosures, and its elevated, defensible position combined with archaeological evidence of ritual activity has led most researchers to interpret it as the earliest occupied section, likely serving religious and possibly royal residential functions during the site's initial development. The valley ruins, spread across the lower ground between the Hill Complex and the Great Enclosure, comprise the remains of numerous smaller stone enclosures that housed what archaeologists believe were successive generations of the kingdom's ruling elite and their immediate households, each enclosure apparently built and occupied for a period before falling out of use as a new generation established its own residence nearby, a pattern of sequential construction that has helped archaeologists trace the kingdom's internal political succession across multiple generations, even in the absence of any written king list or comparable textual record documenting individual rulers by name. The Great Enclosure, the most visually striking and most photographed structure at the site, represents the largest single ancient structure in sub-Saharan Africa south of the Sahara built without mortar, its outer wall curving around an interior space containing a series of smaller stone enclosures and a distinctive solid conical tower whose actual purpose remains one of the site's still unresolved archaeological questions. At its height, the wider settlement surrounding these stone structures likely housed a population that most modern estimates place somewhere between 10 and 18,000 people, a population living substantially in traditional structures built from timber and dhaka, a compacted earth material similar to daub, structures that have not survived archaeologically the way the stone walls did, meaning the visible ruins today represent only the ceremonial and elite core of what was, in its own time, a considerably larger and more socially diverse urban settlement. The wider Zimbabwean plateau itself extends across a rolling landscape of grassland punctuated by scattered granite domes and outcrops known locally as koppies, weathered over millions of years into rounded shapes that early European visitors sometimes compared to sleeping animals. A terrain that offered its ancient inhabitants not just abundant building stone but also natural vantage points for the kind of ritual and defensive positioning visible in the hill complex's own careful integration of constructed walls with the underlying rock formation, human architecture, and natural geology working together in a way that later researchers would come to recognize as a distinctive hallmark of the entire regional building tradition rather than something unique to this single site alone. The construction technique that gives Great Zimbabwe its walls, known technically as dry stone walling, required a level of masonry skill that modern engineers and architectural historians examining the surviving structures have consistently found impressive: granite blocks shaped through careful, controlled fracturing along the stone's natural grain lines, then fitted together course by course with tolerances precise enough that the finished walls needed no binding material at all to remain structurally stable across more than 5 centuries of subsequent weather, earthquakes, and, in some sections, deliberate later damage. Different sections of the walls display distinct decorative patterns that archaeologists have used to help establish relative chronology across the site's centuries of construction, the earlier walls generally showing simpler, more uniform coursing, while later construction phases incorporate more elaborate decorative elements, including the chevron pattern, a repeating zigzag design formed by alternating the orientation of individual stone courses that appears prominently on the upper portion of the Great Enclosure's outer wall, and that has become, in the centuries since, one of the most recognizable visual signatures associated with the entire site. The engineering knowledge this construction required extended beyond simply stacking well-fitted stones. Builders needed to understand load distribution well enough to construct walls curving continuously for hundreds of meters without straight structural sections to provide additional stability, an unusually sophisticated architectural achievement given that curved walls generally present more complex engineering challenges than straight ones, requiring precise calculation of how the wall's own weight and the outward pressure of any earth or fill behind it would be distributed across the entire curved structure. Excavation has also revealed that this stone architecture existed alongside, and likely depended upon, an extensive tradition of earthen and timber construction that has left far less durable physical evidence, post holes and compacted floor surfaces documenting the residential structures where most of the population actually lived and worked, structures whose builders would have needed their own specialized knowledge of local materials and construction techniques suited to the region's climate. Even though this parallel architectural tradition has received considerably less popular attention than the more visually dramatic stone walls that happen to survive the intervening centuries in a form modern visitors can still walk through today. The masons who built Great Zimbabwe's stone walls almost certainly operated within an organized system of specialized labor rather than as isolated individual craftsmen working in scattered improvisation. Evidence for this coming from the remarkable consistency of technique visible across walls built during the same construction phase but located in physically distant sections of the site. A consistency suggesting shared training, shared standards, and probably some form of coordinated oversight directing how construction actually proceeded across what was, by any measure, an enormous and sustained building project requiring the organized labor of many hundreds of skilled workers across multiple generations. Radiocarbon dating conducted across multiple excavation seasons throughout the 20th century, refined further by more recent archaeological work using improved dating techniques, has consistently placed the main construction and occupation period within the range that oral tradition and the broader archaeological context of the region already suggested, evidence that, as later blocks in this account will explore, took considerably longer to be accepted by the colonial authorities who controlled research access to the site than the strength of the physical evidence alone should have required. Modern structural engineers who have examined the surviving walls report finding no evidence of significant structural failure across the site's documented history, aside from sections deliberately damaged during later colonial-era excavation campaigns, a durability record that speaks directly to the underlying quality of the original construction technique, since dry stone walls built without adequate attention to load distribution, drainage, and foundation preparation typically begin showing serious structural problems within a matter of decades rather than remaining fundamentally sound after more than 500 years of continuous exposure to an environment that includes seasonal heavy rains, dramatic temperature swings, and the slow, persistent pressure of plant root growth working its way into any available gap between stones. What made Great Zimbabwe wealthy enough to fund walls of this scale was its position within a trading network connecting the gold-bearing regions of the African interior to the Indian Ocean coast, a network that historians and archaeologists have reconstructed substantially through the physical evidence of imported goods recovered from the site itself, objects that traveled remarkable distances to reach this inland plateau centuries before any European ship had charted a route around the southern tip of Africa. Excavators working at Great Zimbabwe across the 20th century recovered fragments of Chinese porcelain dating to the Ming Dynasty, Persian pottery, glass beads manufactured in India and the Middle East, and coins minted in the Swahili coastal trading city of Kilwa, a coastal settlement that itself functioned as a critical intermediary point, receiving gold, ivory, and other goods carried overland from the interior by traders working networks that connected inland kingdoms like Great Zimbabwe to the wider maritime trade circulating around the Indian Ocean basin, a trade system linking East Africa to Arabia, Persia, India, and ultimately China through a chain of intermediary ports and merchants. Gold represented the single most economically significant commodity moving through this network, extracted from alluvial deposits and shallow mining operations scattered across the plateau region under Great Zimbabwe's political influence, the metal's value driving demand from merchants and rulers thousands of kilometers away who had no direct knowledge of the kingdom or people actually controlling its production, encountering it instead only as raw material or finished goods passing through. the hands of multiple intermediary traders along an extended commercial chain. Ivory, cattle hides, and other valuable goods moved alongside gold through this same network, and the wealth this trade generated appears to have funded not just the monumental stone architecture that survives today, but a broader regional political structure, with archaeological surveys identifying dozens of smaller related stone-walled sites scattered across the wider plateau region. Settlements that most researchers interpret as satellite centers or subordinate territories connected to Great Zimbabwe's political and economic authority, evidence of a substantial kingdom rather than an isolated monumental site standing alone in the landscape. Cattle held economic and cultural significance within this kingdom that extended well beyond their practical value as a food source, functioning also as a primary store of wealth and social status, a pattern documented extensively across many traditional societies throughout eastern and southern Africa. And archaeological evidence from cattle enclosures found at Great Zimbabwe and related sites suggests herds were managed with considerable sophistication, including apparent separation of different animals by age, sex, or ownership status, a level of organized pastoral management that further reinforces the broader picture of a society with real, developed administrative capacity extending well beyond the more visually obvious achievement of the stone architecture itself. The political and social structures that organized this trading kingdom remain considerably harder to reconstruct with confidence than its economic activity, since Great Zimbabwe's builders left no written records comparable to the administrative archives that survive from contemporary literate civilizations elsewhere in the world, meaning most reconstruction of the kingdom's actual governance depends on a combination of archaeological inference, comparative study of related societies in the wider region, and the oral traditions maintained by Shona-speaking communities whose ancestors' historical and cultural connection to the site's builders forms one of the central threads running through this entire story. The gold mining operations that fed this trade network across the plateau region were themselves technically sophisticated, involving shallow shaft mining reaching depths of several meters into gold-bearing quartz veins, work carried out largely without the benefit of iron tools capable of cutting through solid rock, meaning miners relied instead on fire setting, heating exposed rock faces and then rapidly cooling them with water to induce cracking, a labor-intensive but effective technique. Documented at dozens of ancient mining sites scattered across the wider region under Great Zimbabwe's economic influence, evidence of an extraction industry considerably more organized and more technically accomplished than casual assumptions about small-scale, opportunistic gold gathering might otherwise suggest. Shona oral tradition, preserved and transmitted across many generations by communities whose historical and cultural roots in the region long predate any European written record, provides context that archaeological evidence alone cannot fully supply, describing a religious and political system centered on a supreme deity called Mwari, whose worship involved spirit mediums serving as intermediaries between the divine and the human community, a role that carried genuine political as well as religious authority in traditional Shona society. The conical tower at the heart of the great enclosure, one of the site's most visually striking and most debated architectural features, has generated interpretations ranging from a symbolic representation of a grain storage structure, connecting royal authority to agricultural abundance and the ruler's role in ensuring the community's material prosperity, to a phallic fertility symbol connected to Shona religious concepts about royal power and lineage continuity, to a more straightforward architectural monument marking the enclosure's ceremonial significance without any single, confirmed symbolic meaning that current evidence can confirm with confidence. What archaeological and architectural evidence together suggest with somewhat more confidence is that the great enclosure itself likely served functions connected to royal residence, ceremony, and possibly the seclusion of royal wives or other figures of particular ritual significance within the kingdom's political structure, a pattern that finds parallels in the royal architecture of later, better documented Shona and related southern African kingdoms whose own political and religious traditions descended, at least in part, from the same broader cultural framework that had earlier produced Great Zimbabwe. Comparative ethnographic research conducted among Shona-speaking communities during the 20th century, while necessarily separated from Great Zimbabwe's own active period by many centuries of subsequent historical change, has nonetheless helped researchers identify continuities in architectural symbolism, ritual practice, and political structure that support cautious, careful extrapolation backward toward the kingdom's original social organization, an interpretive method that requires real methodological care to avoid simply projecting later cultural patterns uncritically onto a considerably earlier period, but that, applied with appropriate scholarly caution, has nonetheless enriched understanding of Great Zimbabwe considerably beyond what the physical archaeological evidence could support entirely on its own. The relationship between Great Zimbabwe's builders and the broader Shona cultural and linguistic tradition that continues in the region today represents one of the areas where oral tradition, linguistic evidence, and archaeological findings converge with reasonable consistency, supporting the conclusion that the kingdom's population were ancestors of, or closely related to, communities whose descendants still inhabit the wider region, a continuity of cultural connection that later colonial authorities would spend considerable energy trying to obscure or deny, for reasons that had everything to do with contemporary political convenience and almost nothing to do with the actual weight of the historical evidence available to them. Spirit mediums within traditional Shona religious practice, who continue serving comparable ritual and advisory functions in some communities even today, historically held authority that extended well beyond purely spiritual matters, advising rulers on questions of governance, mediating disputes, and serving as living repositories of historical and genealogical knowledge passed down across generations through structured oral transmission rather than written record, a system of knowledge preservation that modern researchers have increasingly come to recognize as every bit as rigorous and every bit as reliable, within its own cultural framework, as the written archival traditions that European scholarship had once treated as the only legitimate form of historical evidence worth taking seriously. Among the most significant and most symbolically charged artifacts recovered from Great Zimbabwe are 8 carved soapstone birds, each perched atop a stone column and depicting a stylized bird combining features that some researchers have identified as resembling the African fish eagle, though the exact species intended, if any single species was intended at all, remains debated. The carvings incorporating enough stylization that precise zoological identification has proven difficult to establish with confidence. These birds, found in various locations across the site, including what appears to have been a dedicated ritual enclosure, likely represented royal ancestors or served as symbols of authority connecting the kingdom's rulers to divine or ancestral sanction for their political power, an artistic and religious tradition that appears, based on comparative archaeological evidence, to have been unique to Great Zimbabwe and its immediate cultural sphere rather than reflecting a widely shared regional artistic convention borrowed from elsewhere. Each of the 8 birds displays subtle individual variation in carving detail, posture, and the specific decorative elements incorporated into its supporting column, differences detailed enough that archaeologists have proposed the birds may have been carved during different periods across the site's occupation, or alternatively that each bird was associated with a distinct ruler or royal lineage, its particular carved details functioning as something closer to an individual heraldic marker than a purely interchangeable religious symbol repeated identically across the entire set, though without accompanying written inscription. The precise significance of these individual variations remains, like much else about the birds, a matter of informed scholarly interpretation rather than settled certainty. The bird's significance to Shona cultural identity and to modern Zimbabwean national identity extends well beyond their original ancient context. Following independence in 1980, the newly renamed nation of Zimbabwe adopted the stylized image of the Great Zimbabwe bird as its central national symbol, incorporating it into the national flag and coat of arms, a deliberate act of reclaiming ancient African achievement as the founding symbol of a modern post-colonial state that had spent the preceding century watching the very civilization that carved these birds treated by its colonial rulers as too sophisticated to have possibly been built. by African hands at all. The physical fate of the original carved birds across the intervening colonial period tells its own smaller story of appropriation and eventual partial restitution. Several birds were removed from the site during the colonial period, ending up in private collections and museums outside Zimbabwe, including one bird that was purchased and taken to South Africa by Cecil Rhodes himself, the mining magnate and colonial administrator whose company controlled the territory and whose name the colony would carry for nearly a century as Rhodesia. Most of the birds have gradually been returned to Zimbabwe across subsequent decades of diplomatic and cultural negotiation, though the full history of ownership, sale, and eventual repatriation for each individual carving remains, for several of the birds, still incompletely documented even today. One bird in particular, held for decades within a museum collection in Germany, became the focus of a sustained diplomatic campaign led by the Zimbabwean government and cultural heritage organizations that finally succeeded in securing its return in 2003, a repatriation ceremony that received considerable international media attention and that Zimbabwean officials explicitly framed, in public statements made at the time, as one small but meaningful step within the much larger, ongoing global conversation about how museums and former colonial powers should handle cultural artifacts originally removed from their countries of origin under circumstances that, in case after documented case, involved considerably more coercion and considerably less genuine consent than the polite language of 19th and early 20th century acquisition records typically bothered to acknowledge. Great Zimbabwe's decline as a major political and economic center appears, based on the archaeological evidence currently available, to have unfolded gradually across the 15th century rather than through any single catastrophic event, a pattern of slow abandonment that historians and archaeologists have proposed several overlapping explanations for, none of them mutually exclusive and none confirmed with the kind of certainty that would settle the question definitively. Environmental strain represents one commonly cited factor. The substantial population that had grown up around the site over several centuries, likely placing increasing pressure on locally available resources, including firewood, agricultural land, and grazing for the cattle herds that formed a central part of the regional economy and diet. Pressure that may have gradually made the immediate area around Great Zimbabwe less capable of sustainably supporting a population of this scale as the centuries wore on. Shifts in the wider regional and international trade networks that had originally generated Great Zimbabwe's wealth offer a second significant explanatory factor, with archaeological and historical evidence suggesting that gold trade routes gradually reoriented toward other regional centers during this period, reducing the commercial advantages that had once made Great Zimbabwe's particular location so valuable, a shift in trade geography that later gave rise to successor states, including the Mutapa Kingdom to the north and the Torwa state to the southwest, each inheriting portions of the broader political, cultural, and economic tradition that Great Zimbabwe had originally established, even as the site itself gradually lost its former political centrality. The Mutapa Kingdom in particular would go on to maintain sustained diplomatic and commercial contact with Portuguese traders and officials along the East African coast for well over a century, generating a considerably richer body of written documentation than exists for Great Zimbabwe's own earlier period, and this later Portuguese Mutapa correspondence, while focused on a different and later political center, has proven valuable to historians working to reconstruct the broader regional, political and economic patterns that Great Zimbabwe itself had originally established, offering indirect but genuinely useful evidence for understanding institutions and practices that likely traced their origin back to the earlier kingdom's own political traditions. By the time the first written accounts referencing the site reached European hands, transmitted through Portuguese traders and officials operating along the East African coast during the 16th century, Great Zimbabwe already existed substantially as a ruin, its stone walls standing empty of the royal court and dense population that had once occupied them, known to Portuguese chroniclers only through second-hand accounts relayed by African intermediaries describing a place called Zimbabwe or similar variant spellings, a name whose etymology most linguists trace to the Shona phrase Zimba Za Mabwe, meaning houses of stone, or a closely related construction referring to venerated or royal stone houses specifically. These early Portuguese accounts, while brief and clearly second-hand, nonetheless preserve valuable evidence that African oral tradition and cultural memory associated with the site remained active and coherent well into the period of early European contact with the region, testimony that later colonial-era researchers, when they finally arrived to study the ruins directly, would have every opportunity to consult and integrate into their own understanding, an opportunity that, as the following blocks explore, several of the era's most influential researchers chose deliberately not to take. One particular 16th-century Portuguese chronicler, João de Barros, recorded a description of the ruins based on information gathered from Swahili and Shona informants along the coast, describing a fortress of stone without mortar located in the interior and explicitly attributing its construction to local African rulers, a straightforward, contemporaneous attribution that later colonial-era researchers, working more than 3 centuries afterward and with considerably less direct access to living oral tradition than de Barros's own 16th-century informants had possessed, would nonetheless find ways to set aside entirely in favor of speculative theories crediting ancient outsiders instead. Serious European scholarly and colonial interest in Great Zimbabwe intensified dramatically following visits by the German geologist Karl Mauch in 1871, whose published accounts of the ruins, while valuable in bringing detailed European documentation of the site to wider international attention for the first time, also introduced a set of theories about the site's origin that would prove remarkably durable and remarkably damaging across the following century of research and public perception. Mauch, working within the specific intellectual framework of 19th-century European racial theory that assumed complex architectural and political achievement required either direct European involvement or connection to other cultures Europeans considered civilized according to their own biblical and classical frames of reference, proposed that Great Zimbabwe might represent the biblical land of Ophir, the legendary source of King Solomon's gold, or alternatively a colony established by ancient Phoenician traders, theories that located the site's true origin firmly outside the African continent despite the complete absence of any archaeological, linguistic, or historical evidence connecting Great Zimbabwe to either ancient Israel or Phoenicia in any specific, verifiable way. These theories, however speculative and however thin their actual evidentiary basis, found an eager and receptive audience among European settlers and colonial administrators throughout southern Africa, offering a convenient origin story that allowed newly arrived colonizers to admire the monumental achievement of Great Zimbabwe's architecture while simultaneously denying that the African populations they were actively displacing and subjugating could possibly have been responsible for building it, a self-serving intellectual framework that conveniently supported the broader colonial ideology, holding that African societies lacked the organizational and technical sophistication necessary for true civilization prior to European contact and intervention. The particular power these Ophir and Phoenician theories held over the colonial imagination owed something as well to their alignment with a broader 19th-century European fascination with lost civilizations and biblical archaeology more generally, a cultural moment in which sensational claims connecting newly discovered ruins to figures from scripture or classical antiquity found ready audiences across popular press coverage throughout Britain and continental Europe, meaning Mauch's speculative Ophir theory arrived at a moment already primed, by broader cultural trends entirely unrelated to Africa specifically, to receive exactly this kind of dramatic, biblically resonant explanation with far more enthusiasm than the comparatively unglamorous, though considerably more accurate, alternative of straightforward African achievement. Cecil Rhodes and his British South Africa Company, which controlled the territory that would eventually bear his name as Rhodesia, took a direct and pointed interest in promoting these non-African origin theories, recognizing that a narrative crediting ancient outsiders with Great Zimbabwe's construction served the company's broader political and commercial interests considerably better than the alternative, considerably more accurate narrative crediting the ancestors of the very African populations whose land the company was actively appropriating and whose labor it was actively exploiting across the wider colonial economy taking shape throughout the region during this exact period. Rhodes himself reportedly took a personal interest in the ruins beyond simply their propaganda value, funding some of the earliest formal expeditions to the site and, according to several contemporary accounts, expressing genuine fascination with the ancient origin theories circulating at the time, a fascination that nonetheless never extended to seriously entertaining the far simpler and far better supported explanation staring the entire colonial establishment directly in the face, that the ancestors of the African workers Rhodes's own company, employed by the thousands across its mining operations, had themselves built one of the most impressive stone structures anywhere on the continent, centuries before any European had set foot in the region at all. Richard Nicklin Hall, appointed to a formal curatorial position at Great Zimbabwe in 1902 under the sponsorship of Rhodes's company, conducted excavations across the following several years that would prove catastrophically destructive to the site's archaeological integrity, motivated substantially by an explicit determination to locate physical evidence supporting the non-African origin theories that colonial authorities and much of the settler public had already, by this point, come to accept as established fact rather than speculative hypothesis. Hall's excavation methods involved systematically removing what he characterized in his own published writing as the uppermost archaeological layers containing what he dismissively termed Kaffir debris, using a deeply offensive racial slur common in the period's settler vocabulary to describe the actual physical evidence, pottery, tools, and other everyday artifacts left behind by the African communities who had actually occupied and used the site across its full history of construction and habitation, material Hall removed precisely because it provided direct physical confirmation of African occupation that contradicted the ancient non-African origin story he had already decided, before conducting any systematic investigation, that his excavation would ultimately support. Contemporary accounts from the period, including internal company correspondence that survives in archival collections, reveal that Hall's superiors within the British South Africa Company were fully aware of and actively supportive of his methodology's explicit goal of finding evidence for non-African origin, meaning the destruction he carried out was not simply the misguided work of one overzealous individual researcher acting alone, but reflected a broader institutional policy, funded and directed by an organization with clear commercial and political incentives to see the resulting excavation reach exactly the conclusions it ultimately, and falsely, claimed to have reached. The scale of destruction Hall's work inflicted on the site's archaeological record remains difficult to fully quantify even now, since the stratigraphic layers and contextual relationships between different archaeological deposits, the precise physical arrangement and sequence that allows trained archaeologists to reconstruct a site's history with genuine confidence, were substantially disturbed or entirely destroyed across large sections of the site before more careful, methodologically rigorous excavation techniques were eventually applied by later researchers working under considerably more scientifically honest conditions. What makes Hall's actions particularly striking in retrospect is that he was not a fringe figure operating outside mainstream colonial institutions. He held an official position, received institutional support from the company controlling the territory, and published his conclusions through channels that lent them the appearance of legitimate scholarly authority, a combination of institutional backing and predetermined ideological conclusion that allowed real, damaging pseudo-archaeological destruction to proceed under the cover of formal scientific investigation, deceiving contemporary readers who had every reasonable expectation that a formally appointed site curator would approach his work with basic methodological honesty, rather than working backward from a conclusion he had already decided upon before excavation even began. Hall's published account of his own work at the site, written for a general popular audience rather than a specialized scholarly readership, reached a considerably wider public than any purely academic archaeological report would typically have achieved. meaning the damage his flawed and ideologically driven methodology inflicted extended well beyond the physical destruction of archaeological evidence at the site itself, actively shaping popular British and settler colonial understanding of Great Zimbabwe for an entire generation of readers who had no independent means of verifying his claims against the archaeological evidence he had, in the course of reaching those very claims, already substantially destroyed. The particular tragedy of Hall's specific methodology is that it did not merely fail to find evidence supporting non-African origin, since no such evidence existed for him to find in the first place, but that it actively destroyed the layers of genuine evidence that would have allowed later, more honest researchers to reconstruct the site's earliest occupation phases with the kind of confidence that intact stratigraphy alone can provide, meaning some questions about Great Zimbabwe's earliest history that might otherwise have been answerable through careful modern excavation remain permanently more uncertain today, specifically because of decisions Hall made more than a century ago, working from a conclusion the evidence never actually supported. The first genuinely rigorous, methodologically sound archaeological investigation of Great Zimbabwe came in 1905, when David Randall Mackie Vere, a British Egyptologist commissioned to provide an authoritative assessment of the site's origin, conducted excavations using considerably more careful stratigraphic methods than Hall had employed, and reached conclusions that directly contradicted the non-African origin theories the colonial establishment had spent the preceding decades actively promoting and funding. Randall Mackie Vere's published findings stated plainly that Great Zimbabwe was unquestionably African in origin and medieval in date, built and occupied by ancestors of the region's existing Bantu-speaking populations rather than by any ancient Mediterranean or Near Eastern civilization, conclusions based directly on the pottery styles, construction techniques, and other physical evidence he had personally excavated and carefully documented using professional archaeological standards considerably more rigorous than the methods Hall had applied only a few years earlier at the very same site. This scientifically sound conclusion was received by much of the settler political establishment in Rhodesia with open hostility, rather than the scholarly acceptance the quality of Randall Mackie Vere's actual archaeological work actually warranted, colonial authorities and much of the settler press dismissing his findings, questioning his professional competence despite his considerable established expertise in the broader field of African and Near Eastern archaeology, and continuing to promote the non-African origin theories that better served the territory's dominant political narrative regardless of what the accumulating physical evidence actually demonstrated. The criticisms leveled against Randall Mackie Vere at the time reveal how thoroughly ideological rather than genuinely scholarly this resistance actually was, several prominent settler commentators suggesting, without offering any comparable archaeological evidence of their own, that Randall Mackie Vere had simply spent too little time at the site to reach reliable conclusions, an accusation that sits awkwardly alongside the fact that his excavation methods, brief as his overall fieldwork period was, still followed considerably more rigorous stratigraphic recording standards than anything Hall had applied during his own multi-year tenure at the site only a few years earlier. A discrepancy in how thoroughly each researcher's work was scrutinized that tracked far more closely with whether their conclusions matched the settler establishment's preferred narrative than with any consistent standard of archaeological rigor applied even-handedly to both men's actual published findings. Gertrude Cotton Thompson, a British archaeologist who conducted a second, even more thorough and methodologically sophisticated excavation campaign at the site in 1929, using systematic stratigraphic excavation techniques and detailed artifact analysis considerably more advanced than anything available to earlier researchers working at the site, reached conclusions that fully confirmed and substantially extended Randall Mackie Vere's earlier findings, stating in her own published work that the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrated purely African origin for the entire site, with no genuine indication whatsoever of any Asian, Mediterranean, or Near Eastern architectural or cultural influence beyond what normal, well-documented trade contact would naturally have introduced through imported goods rather than any direct foreign involvement in the site's actual design, planning, or construction. Cotton Thompson's scientific reputation and her standing as one of the most respected archaeologists of her era, male or female, working anywhere in the world at the time, made her findings considerably more difficult for colonial authorities to simply dismiss through the kind of casual, unsubstantiated criticism that had proven sufficient to deflect Randall Mackie-Vere's earlier, equally sound conclusions. Though, as the following blocks demonstrate, difficulty dismissing evidence and actually accepting its full political implications proved, in practice, to be two entirely separate problems for a colonial government whose fundamental legitimacy depended substantially on maintaining exactly the narrative that this accumulating scientific evidence continued directly contradicting. Cotton Thompson herself later recalled, in writing published well after her original fieldwork, the specific hostility she personally encountered from Rhodesian settler society upon presenting her findings publicly, describing an atmosphere in which prominent local figures approached her directly to express their conviction that her conclusions were simply mistaken, offering no counter-evidence of their own beyond a general, unexamined certainty that African builders could not have been responsible, an experience she characterized as revealing considerably more about the assumptions of the audience receiving her findings than about any genuine scientific weakness in the archaeological work she had actually conducted at the site itself. Despite the accumulated weight of professional archaeological consensus firmly establishing African origin by the 1930s, the government of southern Rhodesia continued for decades afterward to actively suppress this scientifically established conclusion in official publications, tourist literature, and school curricula, a sustained pattern of deliberate historical distortion that extended, remarkably, all the way through the government of Ian Smith's explicitly white minority-ruled Rhodesian state during the 1960s and 1970s. Official guidebooks distributed at the site itself during this extended period were required, under direct government instruction, to present the question of Great Zimbabwe's origin as an open, unresolved scholarly mystery rather than accurately reflecting the settled scientific consensus that had, by this point, existed for several decades among every archaeologist who had actually conducted rigorous, methodologically sound fieldwork at the site itself, a deliberate and sustained falsification. Maintained because acknowledging African origin openly and directly threatened the ideological foundation on which white minority rule in Rhodesia claimed its own legitimacy. Archaeologists and researchers who publicly stated the accurate, scientifically established African origin during this period faced real professional and sometimes personal consequences within Rhodesia, including documented cases of individuals losing academic positions, having research funding withdrawn, or facing direct government pressure and intimidation for stating conclusions that, by any reasonable scholarly standard, simply reflected the accurate archaeological record rather than any form of contested or politically motivated interpretation on the researcher's own part. The Rhodesian government's approach extended into direct control over how the site's own on-location tour guides were permitted to describe its origin to visiting members of the public, official guide training materials during this period requiring staff to present the ancient outsider theories as at minimum equally credible alongside the actual archaeological consensus, meaning ordinary tourists visiting the site throughout these decades routinely left with a substantially distorted understanding of what professional archaeology had already conclusively established, a form of direct, sustained public misinformation carried out not through casual oversight but through deliberate, written government policy governing exactly what paid site employees were permitted to tell the visiting public standing in front of the very walls in question. Peter Garlake, a British archaeologist who conducted significant further excavation and research at the site during the 1970s and who published work that continued reinforcing and refining the established African origin consensus, found himself facing sufficient government pressure and professional obstruction that he ultimately left Rhodesia entirely, relocating to continue his archaeological career and research work in newly independent African nations elsewhere on the continent where he could pursue and publish accurate historical scholarship without the threat of direct government interference that had made his position in Rhodesia increasingly untenable across the final years of white minority rule. The Rhodesian Front government under Ian Smith went further than simply pressuring individual researchers, actively intervening in museum displays and official publications at the site itself, ordering the removal or alteration of exhibit materials that stated African origin too plainly for the government's political comfort, a level of direct, hands-on censorship of a specific archaeological site's own on-location signage and educational material that few other 20th-century examples of politically motivated historical distortion anywhere in the world can match in terms of sheer bureaucratic thoroughness and sustained institutional commitment to maintaining a story the government's own commissioned researchers had already told them, repeatedly and in writing, was simply not true. This decades-long pattern of official, government-mandated historical suppression represents one of the more thoroughly documented examples anywhere in 20th-century archaeology of a political authority deliberately overriding well-established scientific consensus for reasons that were entirely and explicitly ideological rather than reflecting any real, good-faith scholarly uncertainty about what the actual accumulated archaeological evidence had already, for decades, made abundantly and repeatedly clear to every properly trained researcher who examined it honestly. Zimbabwean independence in 1980 brought immediate and deliberate symbolic vindication for the site and the accurate history it represented, the newly formed nation choosing to adopt the name Zimbabwe itself, directly derived from the same Shona terminology describing the ancient stone city, as the name of the entire independent country. A powerful and unambiguous act of historical reclamation that positioned Great Zimbabwe not merely as an interesting archaeological curiosity but as the literal, foundational namesake and cultural touchstone of the new post-colonial nation, replacing the colonial state that had spent the preceding century actively denying the site's genuine African origins and achievements. The stylized Great Zimbabwe bird, adopted as the new nation's central symbol and incorporated into the national flag, currency, and coat of arms, transformed what colonial authorities had spent decades treating as an inconvenient archaeological anomaly requiring careful ideological management into the most visible, most immediately recognizable symbol of modern Zimbabwean national identity, appearing on official government documents, currency notes, and countless other contexts where ordinary Zimbabwean citizens now encounter, on an ordinary daily basis, the direct visual legacy of the ancient civilization that colonial-era authorities had once insisted their own ancestors could not possibly have built. Post-independence archaeological work at the site, no longer constrained by the explicit political pressure and government-mandated distortion that had shaped and suppressed research throughout the colonial period, has continued expanding and refining scholarly understanding of Great Zimbabwe's history, incorporating increasingly sophisticated scientific dating techniques, more thorough integration of Shona oral tradition and cultural knowledge into archaeological interpretation, and considerably more extensive comparative study connecting Great Zimbabwe to the broader network of related stone-walled sites scattered across the wider southern African plateau region. Great Zimbabwe received formal recognition as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1986, an international designation that has helped secure ongoing conservation resources and scholarly attention while also, in its own quiet institutional way, formally closing the book on a controversy over the site's origin that should, by any reasonable scientific standard, have been considered definitively settled by professional archaeologists working at the site as early as the 1930s, more than half a century before international recognition finally arrived to help cement that already scientifically established consensus in broader global public awareness. The transition from colonial Rhodesia to independent Zimbabwe also brought a broader wave of renaming across the country, towns, streets, and geographic features that had carried colonial-era names honoring British administrators and settlers replaced with names drawn from Shona and Ndebele languages and historical tradition, a nationwide project of symbolic reclamation within which the country's own new name, drawn directly from this single archaeological site, stood as the most prominent and most permanent example, a choice that ensured Great Zimbabwe's own history would remain woven into the everyday linguistic and civic life of the nation for as long as the country itself continued to exist under that name. The specific decision to name an entire nation after a single archaeological site remains, among African post-colonial states more broadly, a genuinely distinctive choice, most newly independent nations across the continent instead selecting names connected to broader ethnic, linguistic, or geographic identities rather than a single specific ancient monument, a decision that reflects how completely Great Zimbabwe's particular history of contested origin and eventual vindication had come to symbolize, for the country's independence leadership, the entire broader struggle against colonial denial of African historical achievement that the liberation movement itself had been fighting on considerably wider political and military fronts throughout the preceding decades of armed struggle against Rhodesian white minority rule. Standing today among the curved granite walls of the Great Enclosure, the particular quality of stillness and scale that visitors consistently describe experiencing at the site owes much to the particular combination of the structure's genuine physical mass and the surrounding landscape's own quiet, undramatic character. Rolling grassland and scattered granite outcrops extending toward a horizon broken only occasionally by other similar rock formations rising from the plateau in the distance. Morning light at the site catches the granite walls at an angle that brings the individual courses of carefully fitted stone into sharp visual definition, the chevron pattern along the upper portion of the Great Enclosure's outer wall becoming particularly legible in this early light, each zigzag element clearly distinguishable from its neighbors in a way that flatter midday light tends to compress and obscure, an effect that likely made this same decorative pattern similarly striking and legible to the site's original builders and residents observing their own completed work under comparable early morning conditions many centuries earlier. By afternoon, the same stone takes on a considerably warmer tone, the granite's natural mineral content catching low western light in a way that shifts the entire structure's visual character from the crisp, almost architectural clarity of morning toward something softer and more atmospheric. A daily transformation that repeat visitors to the site often describe as making Great Zimbabwe feel like a genuinely different place depending entirely on the hour someone happens to arrive, the same unchanging stone somehow presenting itself with real variety across the course of a single ordinary day. The interior of the Great Enclosure, reached by passing through a narrow entrance passage that forces visitors to move through the thick stone wall single file before the interior space opens up around them, creates a striking spatial experience even for visitors approaching the site with no particular advanced knowledge of its history. The sudden transition from the passage's enclosed narrowness into the open interior producing an emotional and physical sense of arrival that architectural historians studying the site have suggested was almost certainly a deliberate design choice by the original builders, intended to heighten the ceremonial significance of entering this particular space for anyone approaching it in the site's own active period of use and occupation. The conical tower, standing within the Great Enclosure's interior space, presents visitors today with essentially the same solid, unclimbable, purpose-still debated structure that has puzzled every researcher who has studied it since the site first came to wider international scholarly attention in the 19th century. Its smooth curved surface and precise stone coursing offering no obvious functional explanation, while nonetheless commanding the kind of quiet visual authority that suggests, even without definitive textual or oral confirmation, that this structure held real ceremonial or symbolic importance for the community that built and maintained it across the centuries of the site's active use. Local guides working at the site today, many of them drawing on both formal archaeological training and inherited family knowledge of regional oral tradition, offer visitors a considerably richer interpretive experience than the site's official signage alone can provide. Weaving together the archaeological consensus on construction technique and trade evidence with cultural context about Shona spiritual practice and royal tradition that formal academic publications, however scientifically rigorous, sometimes struggle to convey with the same immediacy and human warmth that a guide speaking from within the same cultural tradition that produced the site can bring to a group of visitors standing in the actual physical space their ancestors once occupied and shaped. The broader pattern that Great Zimbabwe's history illustrates, extending well beyond this single site, connects to a considerably wider historical phenomenon in which European colonial powers across Africa, and in comparable contexts across other colonized regions of the world, repeatedly encountered evidence of sophisticated indigenous achievement, whether architectural, technological, artistic, or political, and repeatedly chose to explain that evidence through theories crediting ancient outside civilizations rather than accepting straightforward evidence of indigenous capability that directly contradicted the ideological assumptions underlying colonial rule itself. This pattern appears, with remarkable consistency, across multiple continents and multiple colonial contexts entirely independent of Great Zimbabwe's own particular circumstances. Ancient earthworks in North America once widely attributed to a supposed lost race of mound builders rather than the actual indigenous American peoples who genuinely constructed them. Sophisticated monumental architecture across various regions of the ancient Americas periodically attributed by outside observers to ancient Egyptian, Phoenician, or even extraterrestrial visitors rather than the indigenous civilizations whose own archaeological and cultural continuity with these sites can, in nearly every documented case, be established with considerable confidence through careful, honest scholarly investigation. What distinguishes Great Zimbabwe's specific case within this broader pattern is the remarkable duration and remarkable directness of the official governmental suppression involved, extending not merely through informal scholarly bias or casual, unexamined cultural assumption but through explicit, documented government policy sustained across multiple successive colonial administrations spanning nearly a full century, from Cecil Rhodes's original company administration through the eventual collapse of Ian Smith's white minority government in the late 1970s, a sustained institutional effort considerably more deliberate and considerably more thoroughly documented than the more diffuse, less centrally coordinated patterns of historical denial and misattribution that characterized many comparable situations elsewhere around the world. The lesson Great Zimbabwe's history offers extends beyond simply correcting one particular historical record, however important that correction truly is in its own right. It illustrates, with unusually clear and unusually well-documented evidence, exactly how political power can distort even scientifically settled questions for multiple generations when the accurate answer directly threatens a ruling authority's own foundational claim to legitimacy, and it illustrates, in the eventual triumph of accurate historical understanding following Zimbabwean independence, that this kind of sustained, deliberately maintained distortion, however entrenched and however long sustained, does not necessarily persist forever once the political conditions sustaining it are finally removed. The specific mechanism by which this particular distortion sustained itself for so long deserves closer attention, because it depended less on any genuine ongoing scientific debate and more on a simple, repeated institutional refusal to update official public messaging in line with what the actual research had already established. A gap between what professional archaeologists privately knew and what government-approved publications publicly stated that widened steadily across the middle decades of the 20th century, sustained not by ignorance but by a series of deliberate administrative choices made by officials who, in several documented cases, were fully aware of the scientific consensus and chose to suppress it in official materials regardless. The academic and popular reassessment of Great Zimbabwe that followed Zimbabwean independence has also prompted broader historiographical reflection on how thoroughly the false Phoenician and biblical origin theories, despite being scientifically discredited among professional archaeologists as early as the 1930s, nonetheless continued circulating in popular literature, tourist guidebooks, and general public awareness well beyond the point when the actual scholarly consensus had already moved decisively and definitively in the opposite direction. This persistence of thoroughly discredited theories in popular consciousness long after their scientific rejection illustrates a broader pattern that historians of archaeology and historians of science more generally have documented across many different contexts entirely unrelated to Great Zimbabwe: the observation that popular, emotionally satisfying narratives, once established in general public awareness, frequently continue circulating for decades or even generations after the professional, scholarly consensus supporting them has been thoroughly and definitively overturned by subsequent, more rigorous research. Guidebook and travel writing published well into the second half of the 20th century, examined retrospectively by researchers studying exactly this pattern of persistent misinformation, reveals authors who were sometimes personally aware of the accurate archaeological consensus, but who nonetheless continued repeating the more dramatic Phoenician or Ophir framing anyway, apparently judging that readers found the ancient outsider story more entertaining or more marketable than the considerably less exotic, though entirely accurate alternative of straightforward African achievement. A small but telling example of how market incentives and simple narrative appeal can sustain a false story quite apart from any deliberate political motive at all. Some of the most valuable recent scholarly work concerning Great Zimbabwe has focused on more fully integrating Shona oral tradition and contemporary cultural knowledge into archaeological interpretation of the site, moving beyond the earlier colonial era pattern in which African oral testimony was either entirely ignored or actively dismissed as unreliable in favor of exclusively European written and physical evidence, an interpretive shift that has produced considerably richer and more nuanced understanding of the site's likely religious, political, and social functions than purely archaeological analysis alone could have achieved working in isolation from this parallel and equally valuable body of traditional cultural knowledge. Contemporary Zimbabwean archaeologists and heritage professionals, working at the site and through affiliated national research institutions established since independence, continue conducting ongoing research and conservation work aimed at further refining scholarly understanding of the site's full history while simultaneously working to ensure that Great Zimbabwe's genuine significance receives the kind of sustained international scholarly recognition and popular public understanding that the preceding century of deliberate colonial-era historical distortion had worked so systematically and so thoroughly to actively prevent and suppress. This ongoing work has also extended into training and mentorship programs designed specifically to build indigenous Zimbabwean archaeological expertise for future generations, a deliberate institutional response to the colonial-era pattern in which nearly all formal archaeological authority over the country's own most significant heritage site had rested, for the better part of a century, almost exclusively in the hands of foreign researchers and foreign-controlled colonial institutions, a pattern that post-independence Zimbabwean heritage policy has worked steadily to reverse through sustained investment in domestic archaeological training and research capacity. The physical scale of what remains unexcavated or only partially studied at Great Zimbabwe remains significant even after more than a century of accumulated archaeological attention, with the broader Valley Ruins section of the site in particular continuing to yield new information through ongoing, carefully conducted research conducted according to considerably more rigorous methodological standards than the site's earliest and most destructive colonial-era investigators ever applied to their own deeply compromised excavation work. Conservation challenges facing the site today include the ordinary, slow physical deterioration that affects any centuries-old dry stone structure exposed continuously to weather, seasonal temperature variation, and plant root growth working gradually into wall joints over extended periods of time, alongside the more particular, historically compounded challenge of repairing and stabilizing sections of the site that suffered real physical damage during the colonial period's various destructive excavation campaigns, damage that in some documented cases proves considerably more difficult and more costly to properly address than the ordinary, expected where that any ancient structure of this scale and antiquity would naturally accumulate simply through the ordinary passage of time. Visitors to the site today can walk through the same narrow entrance passage into the great enclosure that the kingdom's original inhabitants once used, can trace the same chevron pattern along the upper wall with their own eyes, and can stand before the same conical tower that has puzzled researchers for well over a century. This is a direct physical continuity with the ancient past, one that the site's own well-documented history of attempted historical erasure makes feel, for many visitors who arrive already aware of that fuller history, considerably more powerful and considerably more meaningful than it might otherwise. They encounter not merely impressive ancient architecture but tangible, physical proof of a false, politically motivated historical narrative that ultimately failed to hold, regardless of how much sustained institutional and governmental effort was deliberately invested across multiple successive generations in trying to make it hold indefinitely. The nearby site museum, expanded and reorganized considerably since independence, now presents visitors with a straightforward, scientifically accurate account of the site's African origin and its place within the wider regional trading network, a presentation that stands in direct, deliberate contrast to the deliberately ambiguous and misleading official materials that colonial-era authorities once mandated for exactly this same physical location, the museum's own institutional history. Functioning almost as a second, smaller exhibit in its own right, documenting how thoroughly and how recently the accurate story visitors now encounter as straightforward historical fact had to fight its way into official recognition against sustained, well-organized institutional resistance. The stones themselves, patiently fitted together by builders whose individual names history never recorded, have now considerably outlasted both the kingdom that originally commissioned their construction and the colonial government that spent decades trying to claim credit for their existence on behalf of civilizations that had never actually touched them, standing today exactly where their original builders placed them, still holding their shape without a single drop of mortar, still curving. In that same smooth, unbroken line that first caught Karl Marx's attention in 1871 and that continues catching the attention of visitors from around the world who now arrive knowing, with full scientific and historical confidence, precisely whose hands actually built the walls they have traveled to see. The broader significance of Great Zimbabwe's story for understanding how history itself gets written, and how it can be deliberately unwritten and rewritten for explicitly political purposes, extends considerably beyond the archaeological questions this single site initially raised. It offers one of history's clearest documented case studies of how thoroughly a sufficiently determined political authority can distort even a settled scientific consensus, not through honest scholarly disagreement but through the direct, sustained exercise of institutional and governmental power extended across multiple successive generations of deliberate policy. What makes this particular case especially valuable for historians studying the broader relationship between political power and historical knowledge is the unusually complete documentary record surviving from every stage of the controversy, from Marx's original speculative theories through Hall's deliberately destructive excavation methods, through Randall Mackiever's and Cotton Thompson's genuinely rigorous scientific rebuttals, through the documented government policies that continued actively suppressing those scientific findings for decades afterward, despite their own internal awareness that the archaeological consensus had already moved decisively and definitively against the official government position they continued nonetheless to publicly maintain. Researchers examining this documentary record today can pinpoint, with a precision rare in the study of historical misinformation more generally, the exact committee meetings, the exact internal memoranda, and the exact published guideline revisions through which specific Rhodesian officials chose, on specific documented occasions, to maintain the false narrative despite having direct, written access to the accurate archaeological findings their own government had commissioned, a level of documented, traceable institutional decision-making that transforms this case from a general observation about colonial bias into something closer to a detailed administrative case study of exactly how a specific historical lie gets manufactured, maintained, and eventually dismantled. This documentary completeness allows historians and researchers studying the case today to trace, with unusual precision, exactly how and exactly when particular individuals and particular institutions made the deliberate choices that sustained this particular historical distortion across such an extended period, moving the broader discussion beyond vague, general observations about colonial bias in archaeological interpretation and toward considerably more precise, historically documented accountability for exactly which people and exactly which institutions bear direct responsibility for actively suppressing accurate historical understanding of one of Africa's most historically significant archaeological sites. Great Zimbabwe's ultimate vindication, arriving through Zimbabwean independence and the site's subsequent adoption as the new nation's central founding namesake and national symbol, offers a genuinely rare example of a colonial-era historical injustice receiving this direct and symbolically complete form of correction within a relatively compressed historical time frame, the site's own name becoming literally synonymous with the independent nation that emerged to correct the broader political injustice that had, for the preceding century, also included this particular and thoroughly documented pattern of sustained historical and archaeological distortion. This case has since become a frequently cited reference point within broader academic discussions of decolonizing archaeology and heritage management more generally, cited by researchers and heritage professionals working on comparable questions across other formerly colonized regions where similar patterns of politically motivated historical distortion, though rarely as thoroughly documented as the Great Zimbabwe case, nonetheless shaped how indigenous achievement was recorded, dismissed, or actively denied throughout the broader colonial era, making the site's own particular history a genuinely useful case study for understanding this much wider pattern rather than simply an isolated regional controversy confined to a single country's own archaeological record. Tonight, the granite walls of Great Zimbabwe still curve across their 250 meters of unbroken stone, still standing without a single drop of mortar holding them together, still catching the same early morning light that first drew Karl Marx's attention in 1871 and that has drawn every subsequent visitor and researcher who has walked the same ground in the century and a half since. The chevron pattern along the great enclosure's upper wall still traces its careful zigzag rhythm exactly as its original builders shaped it, centuries before anyone thought to question, or to deliberately deny, whose hands had actually done that shaping. What those builders left behind was never, in any honest reading of the physical evidence, mysterious in the way generations of colonial authorities insisted it had to be. It was the capital of an African trading kingdom, built by skilled masons working within a well-established, sophisticated architectural tradition, funded by gold and ivory moving through a trade network stretching all the way to China, governed by a political and religious system whose broader cultural descendants still live in the surrounding region today. What made the site's true origin difficult to accept was never a real absence of evidence. It was the presence of evidence that a colonial political order found directly, existentially threatening to its own claimed legitimacy, and that same order spent nearly a century working, with real institutional power and real documented policy, to keep that evidence from being believed. The birds that once stood watch over this place, most of them now returned home after decades scattered across foreign collections, still carry whatever meaning their original carvers intended, ancestral guardians or symbols of royal authority or something closer to both at once, a meaning modern research has narrowed considerably without ever fully closing the remaining gaps in understanding. Gaps that honest scholarship treats as genuinely open questions rather than evidence of anything there. Site's builders lacked the sophistication to have intended clearly and deliberately in the first place. What survives, in the end, is stone that outlasted the lie built to obscure who raised it, walls that held their shape through more than 5 centuries of weather and, for one particularly damaging period, through the direct excavation efforts of people determined to make those same walls say something other than the truth. They failed. The stones are still standing, still curving in that same unbroken line, still telling, to anyone willing to look honestly, exactly the story they always told. Somewhere in the quiet grassland surrounding the great enclosure tonight, Wind moves across granite that has stood in place since before any European map marked this corner of Africa at all, stones shaped by hands whose names were never written down, working within a tradition passed from builder to builder across generations. A tradition sophisticated enough to raise walls that needed no mortar and no help from anyone outside the community that conceived them. That is the story the stones have always told. It only ever took someone willing to actually listen. If this documentary has kept you company through the night, consider subscribing so you never miss the next quiet journey. And if you are ready for another story from the ancient world, there is one waiting for you on the screen now.